I stayed silent about my wife's affair until everything changed. Welcome to Michael Tells Stories. Here, I share daily infidelity stories about unfaithful wives. Thank you for listening. I learned about my wife's affair on a Tuesday evening that looked exactly like every other Tuesday of our marriage. Quiet, predictable, wrapped in the smell of reheated leftovers and the low hum of a refrigerator that needed fixing but never seemed urgent enough to matter. The discovery didn't come with dramatic music or a shaking hand dropping a phone to the floor. It arrived softly, almost politely, through a message that lit up her screen while she was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize paired with words that carried an intimacy she had stopped using with me months ago. Words that spoke of missing someone's body, someone's laugh, someone's presence in a way that no longer included me. I remember staring at that screen longer than necessary, long enough for the steam to begin creeping under the bathroom door. Long enough for my heart to settle into a strange, heavy calm, as if it had already known and was simply waiting for my mind to catch up. I didn't confront her. That was the first decision I made after everything I thought was solid began to crack. And it surprised even me. In movies, men shout or throw things or demand explanations. But I did none of that. I placed her phone back exactly where it had been, face down on the counter. And I walked into the living room to sit on the couch we had picked together 7 years earlier because it was neutral. Because it would go with anything. Because we were the kind of couple who believed compromise was love's highest form. I sat there and listened to the water turn off, to her humming faintly as she dried her hair, a tune she had picked up somewhere that wasn't here. And I realized that whatever was happening between us had been unfolding quietly for a long time. Long before that message chose to reveal itself to me, silence became my shield. I told myself I needed time. That reacting immediately would only make things messier. That understanding the full shape of the betrayal mattered more than satisfying the urge to confront. What I didn't admit then was that silence also protected me from seeing the confirmation in her eyes. From hearing her voice twist into lies or apologies or worse, indifference. So I watched instead. I observed the way she started guarding her phone like a fragile secret. The way she lingered longer at work. The way she smiled at messages she never shared with me. And I catalogued each detail with a precision that frightened me. As if I were preparing evidence for a trial that might never happen. Her name was Elena. And she had always been the kind of woman people noticed without trying. When we met, she had laughed easily, a sound that filled rooms. And she had talked about wanting a family with the certainty of someone who believed love was a permanent state rather than a series of choices. I had loved her not just for who she was, but for who she made me believe I could be. Steadier, kinder, someone worthy of being chosen every day. Somewhere along the way, that mutual choosing had turned into habit, and habit into distance, and distance into something she tried to fill elsewhere. Knowing that didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it gave it context. A shape that was harder to hate and therefore harder to resolve. Days turned into weeks. And my silence stretched thin but unbroken. I went to work, paid bills, asked her about her day, listened as she answered with careful vagueness. And I wondered if she sensed that I knew. There were moments when our eyes met across the dinner table and something flickered there. Guilt or fear or perhaps just exhaustion. And I would feel a sharp urge to speak, to end the pretending. Each time, I swallowed it down, telling myself that endings deserved preparation, that whatever came next would alter our lives permanently and should not be rushed. What I didn't expect was how much that silence would change me. Without confrontation to anchor my anger, it turned inward and transformed into reflection. I began noticing my own life with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. How small my world had become. How many of my choices were designed to maintain peace rather than pursue joy. I stayed late at the office not because I had to, but because it felt good to be competent, to be valued, to be seen for something other than the role I played at home. I started running again in the mornings, feeling my lungs burn and my muscles ache in ways that reminded me I was still capable of growth. Still capable of choosing myself. Elena noticed the changes. Of course. She asked if I was tired, if work was stressing me out, if something was wrong, and I answered honestly without telling the truth. I said I was thinking, that I wanted more from life, that I felt restless, and I watched her absorb those words with an expression that mixed relief and unease. As if my distance gave her permission to maintain her own. In some strange way, my silence made her affair easier to sustain. And that knowledge hurt more than the betrayal itself. The first real crack in her carefully constructed double life came on an ordinary Sunday afternoon. She was supposed to meet a friend for coffee. A story she had rehearsed enough times to sound natural. But she left her laptop open on the dining table, an email thread glowing on the screen with plans that did not involve coffee or friends or afternoons. I stood there, reading words that confirmed what I already knew. Dates and hotel names and a casual familiarity that spoke of repetition. Not novelty. Something shifted in me then. Not anger, but resolve. A quiet understanding that silence had served its purpose and that change, whatever form it took, was no longer optional. Still, I didn't confront her that day. Instead, I closed the laptop and went for a walk, letting the weight of the truth settle fully into my body. I realized that while Elena had been seeking validation elsewhere, I had been slowly rediscovering parts of myself I had neglected. And that realization complicated everything. The story was no longer just about her affair, it was about the life we had built together. The one we had failed to tend. And the possibility that something new might emerge from its collapse that night. As we lay in bed separated by a small but undeniable distance, she reached for my hand. A tentative gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. I held it, feeling the warmth of her skin. The echo of years spent believing this touch meant safety. And I wondered if love could survive truth. Or if truth was simply the final kindness we owed each other. The answer didn't come then. But I sensed it waiting. Patient and inevitable, just beyond the silence I could no longer maintain forever. The morning everything finally changed did not announce itself with thunder or tears. It came quietly, wrapped in the soft gray light of dawn. The kind that makes the world feel unfinished, as if it's waiting for someone to decide what shape the day will take. I woke before Elena. My mind already heavy with words I had rehearsed in silence for weeks. Words that refused to arrange themselves into something gentle. I watched her sleep, the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint line between her brows that had deepened over the years. And I felt a sadness that surprised me. Not sharp, not explosive, but deep and aching. The kind that comes from mourning something before it officially ends. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where we had signed documents, planned vacations, argued about money, laughed over burned dinners. A witness to a life that had slowly unraveled without either of us daring to name it. When Elena finally joined me, still wrapped in her robe, hair loose and unguarded, she smiled out of habit, then paused, sensing the weight in the air. There are moments in relationships when both people know something irreversible is about to be said, even before the words exist. And this was one of them. "I know," I said before she could ask anything, my voice steady in a way that didn't feel entirely like mine. The word hung between us, simple and devastating, her face drained of color. And for a second she looked almost relieved, as if the effort of hiding had become more exhausting than the truth. She sat down slowly, her hands wrapped around her mug, not drinking, just holding it like an anchor. She didn't deny it. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. She whispered my name, the way she used to when she needed comfort. And then she cried, quietly at first, then with a desperation that shook her shoulders. I listened as she spoke. About loneliness, about feeling unseen, about mistakes that started small and grew heavy, about love that didn't disappear but became dull and fragile. I listened not because I was obligated to forgive, but because after so many weeks of silence, hearing the truth felt like finally opening a window in a room that had been suffocating us both. What she didn't expect was my calm. I wasn't cold, but I wasn't pleading either. Somewhere during my silence, I had crossed an invisible line, one that separated the man who was terrified of losing his marriage from the man who understood that staying at the cost of his dignity would be a different kind of loss. I told her how long I had known, how watching her choose someone else had forced me to look at myself, at the parts of my life I had abandoned, at the quiet resentment we had both allowed to grow unchecked. I told her that her affair was not the beginning of the end, but it had become the moment everything could no longer stay the same. For days after that conversation, we existed in a strange in-between. There were tears and apologies, moments of closeness that felt almost hopeful, followed by stretches of silence that felt heavier than before. Elena said she ended the affair, showed me messages, deleted numbers, offered transparency as proof of commitment. I believed her, or at least I believed that she wanted to believe in us again. And that distinction mattered more than I expected. Trust, I learned, doesn't shatter all at once, it erodes, grain by grain, and rebuilding it requires more than honesty. It requires time. Neither of us could rush during that time. Something unexpected happened. Elena began to change too. Not in grand gestures, but in small, uncomfortable ways. She started therapy, confronted parts of herself she had long avoided, spoke openly about her fears of being ordinary, of disappearing into roles that left no room for desire or ambition. Watching her face those truths stirred conflicting emotions in me: pride, compassion, and a lingering doubt about whether growth alone could repair what had been broken as weeks turned into months. The question stopped being whether I could forgive her and became whether staying would allow either of us to truly thrive. I noticed how alive I felt when I imagined a future shaped by my own choices, not just compromises, and that realization frightened me more than the idea of being alone. Elena sensed it too. One evening, After a long walk that ended with us sitting on a park bench in silence, she asked me the question neither of us wanted to voice: "If you stay," she said softly, "will it be because you want me? Or because you're afraid to leave?" I didn't answer immediately. Honesty, once unleashed, is demanding. I told her that I still loved her, but that love alone no longer felt like enough of a reason to rebuild the same life. I told her that part of me wanted to see who we could become apart. Not as punishment, not as failure, but as a chance to choose ourselves without resentment. The words hurt us both, but they also carried a strange relief, like finally setting down a weight we had been carrying for years. The decision to separate was mutual, though no less painful for it. We divided our lives carefully, respectfully, each object carrying memories neither of us could fully release. There were tears, late-night conversations, moments of doubt, but there was also an emerging clarity, a sense that this ending, while not the one we imagined when we married, was honest in a way our silence never had been months later. Our lives looked different. I moved to a smaller place closer to the city, threw myself into work that challenged me, built friendships that reminded me who I was before I became someone's husband. Elena traveled, pursued a career shift she had long postponed, learned to stand alone without seeking validation to fill the emptiness. We stayed in touch, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Two people who had loved deeply and learned painfully. The irony was not lost on me. By staying silent about my wife's affair, I had given myself the space to listen to my own life, to hear the quiet truths I had ignored for too long. Everything changed not when I discovered her betrayal, but when I chose to stop betraying myself. And in that change, there was no villain, no victim, only two flawed people who learned. Too late perhaps, but honestly, that love without truth is just another kind of silence. Time, I learned, does not heal in straight lines. It circles back, revisits wounds with new questions, tests the lessons we think we've already mastered. A year passed after our separation, a year filled with firsts that felt both liberating and lonely. The first apartment that smelled only like me, the first holiday spent without negotiating traditions, the first moments of happiness that arrived without guilt. I grew into my life with intention, building routines that reflected who I had become rather than who I used to be. And yet Elena remained a quiet presence in the background of my thoughts. Not as regret, but as something unfinished, a chapter that refused to close neatly. We met occasionally, carefully, always in public places where emotions stayed restrained. Coffee shops, parks, neutral spaces where neither of us felt tempted to rewrite history. She looked different. Lighter in some ways, sharper in others. Her confidence no longer borrowed from attention but earned through effort. She spoke about her work with a clarity I hadn't heard before. About projects she led, risks she took, mistakes she owned without flinching. Watching her, I realized that the woman sitting across from me was not the one who had sought escape in another man's arms. She was someone who had faced the emptiness inside herself and chosen to fill it with substance instead of secrecy. There was no talk of reconciliation at first. That silence was different from the one that had nearly destroyed us. This one was respectful, patient, rooted in understanding rather than avoidance. Still, something subtle shifted during one of those meetings. A moment so ordinary it would have been easy to miss. We were walking along the river after coffee, talking about nothing important, when she laughed, really laughed, and I felt that familiar warmth spread through my chest. Not nostalgia, not longing, but recognition. It struck me then that love does not disappear simply because a relationship ends, it changes shape. Waits for conditions that allow it to exist honestly. The question that followed wasn't whether we still loved each other, but whether we could love without repeating old patterns. Elena was the first to name it. One evening as the city lights reflected in the water and the air carried the promise of rain, she said she didn't want to go back to who we were. Didn't want forgiveness that erased accountability. Didn't want comfort built on fear of loneliness. She said if there was ever a chance for us again, it would have to be as equals who chose each other freely. Without obligation or silence, her words stayed with me long after we parted that night. I thought about the man I had been when I first discovered her affair. Quiet, watchful, afraid of confrontation. And I compared him to the man standing there now, capable of speaking his needs without apology. Growth, I realized, had not erased the pain, but it had given it meaning. It had taught me that love is not proven by endurance alone, but by the courage to leave and the wisdom to return only if returning honors both people. When we finally decided to try again, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sweeping declaration, no promise to undo the past. We agreed to start slowly, to date as if we were strangers who happened to share a history, to ask difficult questions early, to leave if honesty began to feel optional. Elena set boundaries with a firmness that spoke of self-respect, and I found comfort in her clarity. She no longer sought reassurance at the expense of truth, and I no longer mistook silence for strength. What surprised me most was how much lighter love felt this time. There was still caution, still moments when old fears surfaced, but they were addressed, not buried. Elena shone in this new version of herself, a woman who had confronted her flaws and refused to be defined by them. Her happiness was no longer tied to whether I stayed or left, it existed independently. And that independence made choosing her feel like a privilege rather than a responsibility in the end. The story did not reward silence. It rewarded growth. Whether together or apart, Elena emerged with her dignity intact, her voice restored, her life firmly her own. And I learned that sometimes staying silent is not about avoiding conflict, but about listening long enough to understand what truly needs to change. Everything changed not because of betrayal, nor forgiveness, but because two people finally learned how to choose themselves, and in doing so, learned how to choose each other without losing who they were meant to become. The final shape of our story did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded the way real lives do. Quietly, imperfectly, through a series of choices made on ordinary days when no one is watching. Loving Elena again required more than affection or shared history. It required restraint, patience, and a respect for the woman she had become, not the one I once tried to protect from consequences. We moved forward slowly, deliberately, allowing trust to rebuild not as an expectation, but as a result, something earned through consistency rather than promised in emotional moments. Elena flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. With the weight of secrecy and self-betrayal gone, she grew more confident, more grounded. Her happiness no longer fragile or dependent on external validation. She spoke openly about her ambitions, her fears, her boundaries, and she enforced them with a calm firmness that commanded respect, including my own. Watching her choose herself again and again, even when it meant disagreeing with me or stepping back, I understood that this was the truest form of love I could offer her. The freedom to be whole, even if that wholeness eventually led her away from me. There came a moment, unplanned and unguarded, when Elena admitted she was happy regardless of where our relationship landed. We were sitting on her balcony one evening, the city breathing softly around us. And she said it without drama, without hesitation. She said she no longer feared being alone, no longer feared starting over, no longer feared disappointing anyone by choosing what felt right to her. The peace in her voice was unmistakable, and in that instant, I knew the ending of our story would be a good one. Not because it guaranteed permanence, but because it honored truth we decided then, together, that we would continue forward, not bound by vows we once broke, but guided by values we had finally learned to live by. There was no grand remarriage, no public declaration meant to convince the world we had survived something tragic. Instead, there was a quiet commitment renewed daily through honesty, respect, and the understanding that either of us could walk away if staying ever required silence again. Elena kept her name, her independence, her sense of self. She traveled when she wanted, pursued her career with determination, nurtured friendships that had nothing to do with me, and loved me not as an escape, but as a choice. If one day our paths were to diverge, she would still stand strong, fulfilled, and unapologetically whole. That knowledge did not threaten me, it humbled me. Looking back, I no longer define our story by the affair or the silence that followed. Those moments were catalysts, painful but necessary, stripping away illusions we mistook for stability. What remains is a deeper understanding of love, one that does not ask women to shrink to preserve relationships, one that does not reward endurance at the cost of dignity. Elena's happiness was never meant to be a compromise, and my role was never to save her, only to meet her where she stood, or step aside with respect. In the end, everything changed not because I stayed silent, but because silence forced us to listen. To ourselves first, then to each other. The ending was not perfect, but it was honest, and in that honesty, Elena found peace, purpose, and joy on her own terms. That, more than reconciliation or separation, was the true victory, and the kind of ending every story like ours deserves. That's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment with your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.